love books, and they love me. I get them free at the library. I read them once. I read them twice. Library books are oh so nice. Hi friends. Today I thought we would talk about somebody that is a very famous person. You might know him as the person that's on the quarter or the dollar bill, and that would be George Washington. You probably already know that he was our very first president of the United States of America. So let's read this National Geographic's kid book about George Washington. George Washington by Caroline Crossan Gilpin. And look, there's George Washington's signature. That means that's the way he signed his name. And this book was copyrighted in 2014. And look at this. This book has a table of contents, which you remember we were talking about that at school, about how it's different sections or different chapters of the book, and it will tell which page those sections or chapters on in case you only wanted to read one part. And this one also has a glossary at the end on page 32, which tells you what some of the words in this book are and what they mean. So let's get started. Who was George Washington? George Washington was the first president of the United States. He was a farmer, a soldier, and a hero. He helped America become a free country. And this is a portrait of George Washington. And over here it says words to know. Portrait means a picture or painting of a person. So that is a painting or a picture of George Washington. Growing up. George was born on February 22nd, 1732, on a farm in Virginia to a large family. He spent much of his time with his older brother, Lawrence. Lawrence lived on a plantation called Mount Vernon. He was an army officer. George wanted to be just like him. Now this says plantation is a large farm that grows plants for food and clothing. And we have a fact. It says that's a fact. George Washington owned more than 30 foxhounds during his lifetime. Foxhounds are types of dogs that like to chase fox, of course, and that's one of the things that George Washington liked to do. George Washington grew Mount Vernon into a large plantation. It had 8,000 acres of land, and that's his house called Mount Vernon. Lawrence Washington was 14 years older than his brother George, so he was almost old enough to be George's father. Teaching himself. When George was 11, his father died. He had to stop going to school to help at home. But George read a lot and taught himself. When he was 17, he got a job measuring land to make maps. George was brave and strong. He was very good at riding horses. This helped him become a great soldier a few years later. This says measuring land was called surveying. It was an important job, and George did it well. When George was just 23 years old, he was asked to lead the Virginia soldiers. This is a portrait of him in his uniform. So he looks much younger there than he did that first picture we saw. Becoming a leader. In the 1700s, America was not yet the United States of America. It began as just 13 colonies ruled by King George III in England. And you remember we talked about England during our Read Across America week. It's across the Atlantic Ocean from us. So we would live somewhere right in here. And there's the 13 original colonies. And you see on this globe, there's Great Britain or England that we talked about. People came on ships to live in America. They wanted more freedom than the king would give them in England. There's a picture of the king. King George III ruled England for 59 years. England is part of Great Britain. Wales and Scotland are also part of Great Britain. Here's just a word to know. Colonies. What America's first 13 states were called before America became independent from Britain. So that means whenever the king ruled over this area here, they were called colonies, not states yet. In his time, many things were very different in the 1700s, because you know that's like 200 or 300 years ago. Home. Many colonists lived on farms and built most of their own houses and furniture. They used homemade candles to light their rooms. They couldn't go into their house and flip on a switch to turn the light on. Food. Most people grew their own vegetables such as squash and peas. They hunted animals such as deer and rabbits for meat. Staying in touch. There were no telephones. People used feather pens and ink to write long letters. The letters took weeks to reach the other person. Maybe that's why they had to write such long letters, because they had to tell them lots of stuff. Chores and school. Children helped with farm chores. Most children did not go to school. They learned to read and write at home, kind of like what you're doing now. Mount Vernon. Sadly, when George was 20, his brother Lawrence died. Later, George became the owner of Mount Vernon. In 1759, George married Martha Custis. They were happy together at Mount Vernon. Here's just another fact. George Washington did not have a middle name, so he was just George Washington. Martha Custis and George Washington married 10 months after they met. So they didn't have a long time. They knew each other before they got married. The making of a hero. In the 1760s, there was trouble coming. King George III made the colonists pay extra money for tea and other supplies they needed. The colonists didn't think it was fair. They were angry. They wanted freedom from England. They asked George Washington to lead the American army against the British army. This picture shows an event called the Boston Tea Party. To show they were unhappy with King George III, the colonists dressed up as American Indians. They threw British tea into the Boston harbor. George Washington was a great leader. He was smart and brave. He strongly believed in American freedom. So there he is leading his soldiers against the British. War and peace. The Revolutionary War started in 1775. The British thought they would win. They had more men and supplies. American soldiers didn't have enough food or warm clothes, but they would do almost anything for freedom. In 1776, America's leaders signed the Declaration of Independence. It said America had a right to be free and to make its own rules. The British didn't agree. They sent more troops to fight. Look at this part that says, in their own words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that comes from part of the Declaration of Independence. Words to know. Revolutionary War is America's fight for independence from Britain. Declaration of Independence, this thing here. The statement written in 1776 that said Americans had the right to make their own decisions about their country and its people. And I'll bet King George III didn't like that. Let's open this up. For 8 long years, the war went on. The British were tired of fighting a war far from home. The British were beginning to run out of supplies and money. Finally, they gave up in 1783. America had won its freedom. On Christmas Day in 1776, George Washington led his soldiers across the frozen Delaware River. They made a surprise attack on British troops the next morning. George's men won the battle. It gave them hope that they could win the war, and they did. And this is a famous painting. It's very large, and it's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, if you ever get to go and have a chance to see it. 5 cool facts about George. Number 1, look, there's his teeth. You see them? He had false teeth made from things like lead and ivory. He did not have wooden teeth. Number 2, he was born on February 22nd, but today most Americans celebrate his birthday on the 3rd Monday of that month, often called President's Day, and we get to have school off that day. Number 3, he liked fox hunting on horseback. One of his favorite horses was called Blueskin. He's kind of blue colored. Number 4, he liked cornmeal pancakes called hoe cakes with butter and honey for breakfast. Number 5, he was very tall, almost 6 feet 3 inches. He had size 13 feet. Very first president. How would this new country work? In 1787, men from each state came together to write new rules for the United States. They called these rules the Constitution. Then they had to choose a new leader. George Washington was elected the first president of the United States in 1789. It was a big job to unite the new country. Unite means to bring together. In their own words, George Washington's friend Henry Lee III said that Washington was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. George Washington became president on April 30th, 1789. He didn't want to be called King Washington or have people bow to him. He chose to be called President. Home again. After 8 years as president, George gave up his power. He was happy to go home to Mount Vernon again. He had many visitors. He rode his horses every day. In December 1799, George got sick with a bad sore throat. There was no medicine in his time to cure him. He was 67 years old when he died. And here's a timeline of different things that we've just read about whenever it was in his lifetime. In his honor, George Washington was greatly loved. He is the only president to have a state named after him. His face is on the dollar bill, the quarter, and a U.S. postage stamp. There they are. Washington, D.C., America's capital city, is also named for George. So there's Washington, D.C., and then Washington State is over here. George Washington is one of 4 presidents carved in rock at Mount Vernon National Memorial in South Dakota. And there he is, right there. That's a fact. George Washington was the only president who did not live in the White House, and that's because it wasn't built yet. John Adams was the second president, and he was the first president to live in the White House. At 555 feet, the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. is the world's tallest stone structure. So that's named after George Washington, so that when we look at that, we can remember a great man and the great things that he had done.